Ground crew girls don't belong anywhere near a cockpit. Leave the flying to real pilots. That's what they say. The kind of easy judgment people make when they think they already know your limits. Until a sound from the horizon cut through it like a blade. The base went silent, not because of what they saw, but because no one believed it was possible. An A-10 Thunderbolt tore out of Raven Gorge. So low the desert dust clung to its wings, 12 feet above the ground. The engines roared like defiance itself, and when the canopy opened, the quiet ground crew girl stepped out, calm, steady, her gaze unshaken. Every SEAL on that runway knew in that instant they just witnessed something they would never forget. They didn't see her as a pilot or even someone who belonged near a cockpit. In their minds, she was just part of the background, the map girl who handed out flight plans and kept the coffee pot full. From a distance, Captain Erin Cross looked like the most unremarkable person on the airstrip. She wore the same olive drab fatigues as 100 others, her dark hair tied back in a regulation bun, a clipboard in one hand, a coffee cup in the other. She moved with quiet purpose, slipping between maintenance crews, checking off fuel loads, inspecting flight plans. Her voice was low, precise, just loud enough to be heard over the hum of generators and the whine of distant turbines. To the Navy SEALs and pilots at Sentinel Joint Training Base, Erin was the map girl, the one who stayed behind in the climate-controlled operations room while others took to the skies or marched into the desert. They knew her as a technical officer, someone good with charts and numbers, someone who could calculate wind drift and fuel consumption without blinking. Useful? Yes. Impressive? Not in their eyes. And in the culture of a military base, where status is worn on your shoulder boards and carved into your call sign, Erin Cross was invisible. The SEALs swaggered through the hangars in sun-faded uniforms, laughing at inside jokes, trading stories about near misses and hard landings. They spoke loudly, like their words were another kind of weapon, and they moved like the world was their drop zone. To them, danger was a challenge, not a caution sign. Risk wasn't to be minimized. It was to be conquered. Erin was the opposite. Her workspace was quiet, controlled, full of details that didn't make for good bar stories. Fuel calculations, terrain analysis, radio dead zones. She spent hours at a desk mapping safe corridors through the desert, factoring in every possible hazard. To the men in the ready room, that was the problem. She built safety margins into everything. Too much altitude here, too wide a turn there. They called it flying for grandmothers. They didn't see prudence as wisdom. They saw it as fear. And here's the thing. In the military, quiet competence doesn't turn heads. Combat ribbons do. Stories about pushing the limits do. And if you're the person keeping everyone alive by not pushing those limits, most people don't notice. Or if they do, they chalk it up to luck, not skill. That's why Raven Gorge was such a point of contention. The gorge was a scar in the earth, 12 miles long, its sandstone walls rising like a trap on either side. Wind shear inside it could flip a helicopter like a toy. Updrafts would send a fixed-wing aircraft skimming higher than it should, only to drop it like a stone when the air shifted. Worse, the rock walls blocked radio contact, leaving anyone inside completely cut off. On the maps Erin maintained, Raven Gorge was marked with a thick red line. Restricted, no training flights. Every flight plan that came across her desk avoided it completely. The SEALs didn't see a death trap. They saw a shortcut, a way to cut precious minutes off a training run, to make an approach feel more like combat. Pilots, especially the young ones, grumbled about it in the mess hall. She's scared of the terrain. She's never flown it, so she can't know. If the Air Force wanted it restricted, they'd have made it official. They didn't know that Erin had flown Raven Gorge. They didn't know she'd flown it in combat, under fire, at an altitude that would make most pilots' hands shake for days. They didn't know, because Erin had made sure they didn't. She'd buried her combat record under the weight of an official ground assignment 3 years ago, trading the cockpit for the relative safety of an operations desk. Whatever Raven Gorge meant to her, she kept it locked away with the rest of those memories. From my perspective, this is where the military culture shows its cracks. There's a bias, not always malicious but deeply ingrained. That real soldiers, real pilots, are the ones in the thick of the fight. If you're supporting from the sidelines, you're secondary. And the quieter your work, the more invisible your value becomes. The irony? It's people like Erin, the ones who calculate, prepare, and quietly pull the strings, who keep the loud ones alive. But that's a truth you only appreciate after you've seen what happens without them. On that warm desert morning, Erin stood by the runway, her clipboard tucked under one arm, watching the dust blow across the tarmac. Out in the distance, the heat shimmered above the sand like a mirage. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Raven Gorge, carved deep into the earth, waiting like a patient predator. She didn't know it yet, but before the week was out, that red line on her map would become a battlefield. Not just for survival, but for respect. And the people who laughed the loudest would find out exactly what it meant to thread a jet through the heart of Raven Gorge and live to tell about it. Erin Cross didn't talk about Yemen. It wasn't because she wanted to hide the medal, though the Distinguished Flying Cross sat buried in a shoebox under old flight manuals. It wasn't even because of the injuries, though her spine still ached on cold mornings and her left shoulder never quite rotated the way it used to. It was because the story never sounded like triumph when she told it. It sounded like survival. And survival in her mind wasn't something you bragged about. It was something you carried. 3 years earlier, Yemen's Al-Hudaydah province, desert sun hammering down like a punishment. Her A-10, call sign Vixen 7, was circling in a holding pattern over a pinned-down Marine unit. Enemy insurgents had them cornered in a dried-out riverbed, with RPG teams scattered along the canyon walls. The conventional approach was suicide. Anti-aircraft fire covered every high-level entry, and the only possible route in was a jagged cut in the terrain, a natural corridor barely wider than her wingspan. The flight computer said it was too risky. So did her wingman. Vixen 7, that's a no-go. You won't have room to climb out. Copy, Erin had replied, then quietly to herself, we're going in. The first seconds inside the gorge were chaos. Turbulence from updrafts smacking the A-10 sideways. Proximity alarms screaming as the rocky walls closed in. Erin kept her eyes forward, her hands steady, every muscle in her body anticipating the next unpredictable gust. She dropped to 20 feet, then 15. At one point, her altimeter read 8 feet above ground level, a number no pilot wanted to see while moving at 200 knots. The titanium bathtub armor around her cockpit felt like the only thing between her and the canyon walls. When she reached the Marines, they were down to their last magazine. She strafed the ridge with her GAU-8 Avenger, the 30mm cannon thundering so close that the sound bounced off the rock and doubled back like rolling thunder. In less than a minute, the insurgent positions were shattered. In less than 5, she was climbing out, barely, with warning lights flashing across her HUD. Then the SAM hit. The missile didn't explode directly. The shrapnel shredded her right engine and peppered the fuselage. Hydraulic pressure bled out fast. She lost elevator control entirely on the starboard side. The A-10 could take damage that would kill any other aircraft, but even the Warthog had its limits. Erin nursed it back across the desert, losing altitude with every mile. She made the airstrip but landed hot, the wheels screaming on impact, skidding to a stop with less than 200 feet of runway to spare. She didn't remember much after that, just the smell of jet fuel, the shouting of medics, and the crack of a morphine vial being snapped open. People liked to tell her it was heroism that day, that she had guts other pilots didn't. But Erin never saw it that way. From her point of view, it was math. Cold, uncompromising math. She'd calculated the odds, not for glory, not to prove she could, but because 16 Marines would have died if she didn't. And that was the part no one understood. When you've already paid the cost once, you stop gambling with it. That's why back at Sentinel Base, she spent hours alone in the operations room running theoretical scenarios. She would take an aircraft type, Apache, Black Hawk, F-35, and model its performance through Raven Gorge under different wind speeds, payload weights, and altitudes. She had notebooks filled with numbers, each margin scribbled with warnings in red ink. To outsiders, it looked obsessive. To her, it was survival on paper. Every simulation was a replay of Yemen in a different skin. a way to face the gorge without ever stepping foot in it again. From my perspective, this is where you see the sharp divide between pride and prudence. Most people think the enemy of caution is fear, but in truth it's ego. A pilot who's never been forced to pull a crippled aircraft out of hostile airspace still believes skill can outfly circumstance. A pilot who knows better. Combat changes the way you see the margins. Before Yemen, Erin thought of them as buffers. After Yemen, she saw them as life preservers, thin, fragile, and worth every inch you could get. In the quiet of Building 7, when the generators hummed and the desert wind rattled the thin windows, Erin would sometimes lean back in her chair and close her eyes. She'd hear the gorge again. Not Raven Gorge, but that nameless cut in Yemen. The roar of her engines bouncing off the walls, the metallic heartbeat of the GLU-8, and the radio call from the Marines. Air cover, we see you. We're still here because of you. That was why she kept the red line across Raven Gorge on every map. Not because she doubted pilot skill, but because she knew the truth. The gorge doesn't forgive mistakes, and not every pilot comes home. The black SUVs rolled through Sentinel's front gate just after sunrise, their tinted windows reflecting the desert light like cold glass. In the passenger seat of the lead vehicle sat a man in a tailored Navy suit, checking his watch before the wheels even stopped. The convoy parked in perfect alignment and outstepped the kind of people who only showed up when money or politics were involved. At the center of the group was Colonel Mason Hartwell, Sentinel's base commander, flanked by two aides with clipboards. Behind him came a half-dozen civilians in suits, members of a Pentagon Oversight Committee, followed by three men with glossy briefcases stamped with the unmistakable logo of Apex Defense Systems, one of the largest military contractors in the country. Among them was Victor Kane, Apex's Director of Operations. Kane was tall, silver-haired, and wore a smile that never touched his eyes. He had the posture of someone who believed he was the smartest man in any room, and a handshake that lasted just long enough to make you wonder if he was measuring your grip. By 9 a.m., the operations building was buzzing. Erin sat at her desk in Building 7, the day's flight plans neatly stacked in front of her. She'd already heard whispers. The visitors were here to review training protocols, streamline operations, and, more worryingly, evaluate restricted airspace designations. Her stomach tightened when she saw the list. Raven Gorge was on it. "Miss Cross," Hartwell's voice came from behind her desk, unexpectedly polite. She turned to see the Colonel, Kane, and one of the committee members standing there. "We'd like to discuss your restriction on Raven Gorge." Erin stood, keeping her tone professional. "The gorge presents significant navigational hazards. Wind shear, unpredictable thermals, radio dead zones," Kane interrupted with a small laugh. "We've reviewed the satellite imagery. It looks perfectly viable. No recorded crashes, no documented incidents. In fact, using it would cut training fuel consumption by 14% and shave minutes off approach times." "It's not suitable for training operations," Erin repeated. "According to who?" Kane asked, tilting his head. "According to flight safety protocols and—" Kane raised a hand. "And have you personally flown it, Miss Cross?" Around the room, conversations quieted. The young SEALs at the planning table leaned back in their chairs, eyes flicking between Erin and Kane. "I have," Erin said evenly. But Kane pressed on, his voice just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Because from our records, you've been on ground assignment for the last 3 years, so your restriction is based entirely on theoretical models, not recent field experience." A murmur rippled through the room. Sergeant Blake Moreno, one of the younger SEALs, chuckled. "She's always been conservative with flight paths, safety margins on her safety margins." Another voice from the back added, "Ground crew thinking." Kane smiled faintly, as if their comments validated his point. "So here's what I'm recommending. We rescind the restriction, effective immediately. Pilots can train through Raven Gorge at operational altitudes, 50 feet, 20 feet, whatever the mission profile requires." Erin felt her jaw tighten. "Absolutely not. The gorge floor has unpredictable thermals, crosswinds that can flip rotorcraft, rock formations that create radar shadows. It's not a training ground. It's a trap." Kane's smile thinned. "Based on what? Your computer models? Your Common sense? We need hard data, Miss Cross. Otherwise, you're restricting an asset the base could use. Around the table, some of the younger pilots looked intrigued at the idea of flying the gorge. Others just smirked, enjoying the spectacle of a civilian expert publicly undermining her. Colonel Hartwell cleared his throat. We'll note your objection, Lieutenant, but this review will move forward. From my perspective, this was the moment that perfectly captured the overlap between military politics and corporate boardrooms. In both, the people making decisions often aren't the ones who face the consequences. The boardroom executive deciding to streamline operations rarely has to stand on the production floor when the new policy goes wrong. And the Pentagon committee member who approves a cost-cutting maneuver isn't the one flying an aircraft at 12 feet through a canyon when the wind shifts. In both worlds, hard data is king, but only the kind of data that supports the decision they already want to make. Real-world experience, especially if it contradicts the spreadsheet, becomes subjective. It's why so many veterans roll their eyes when they hear the phrase efficiency review. Kane closed his tablet with a snap, signaling the discussion was over. We'll proceed with the recommendation. Expect the first training flights through Raven Gorge by next week. The SEALs began talking excitedly, some already speculating about who would take the first run. Moreno grinned. I'll go. How hard can it be? No one noticed Erin remained standing by the conference table, her hands flat against the wood, knuckles pale. She wasn't angry because they disagreed with her. She was angry because she knew exactly what was going to happen, and that no one in that room had any idea how close they were to writing a death notice. When the meeting broke, Erin walked back to her desk in silence. She opened the locked drawer where she kept her old mission logs and pulled out a folded map of Raven Gorge. Her finger traced the route, the tight turns, the altitude notations scrawled in red. She could still feel the stick in her hand, the vibration of the Ju-8, the way the gorge walls seemed to close in until there was no margin left. If they wanted proof, she would give it to them. Not a report, not a simulation, something they couldn't dismiss. By the time the sun set, Erin had made up her mind. The gorge wasn't opening without her flying it first. The hangar was almost empty when Erin walked in, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing over concrete floors. Vixen 7 sat in the far corner, scarred, patched, and silent, like a warhorse that hadn't been saddled in years. The A-10's gray paint was faded by sun and sand, but to Erin, every dent and weld was a memory. She ran her hand along the titanium skin, feeling the ridges where shrapnel had once gouged deep. In Yemen, those scars had been the difference between making it home and becoming a name on a plaque. Tonight, they would mean something else, a reminder to every wide-eyed pilot who thought Raven Gorge was just another thrill ride. Pre-flight was muscle memory, hydraulics check, weapon systems, disabled but intact, fuel at 100%, flaps, trim, control surfaces, smooth. She strapped in, the harness snug against her flight suit, and pulled her helmet into place. The smell inside the cockpit was a time capsule. Jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, the faint metallic tang of the GAU-8 cannon she'd fired more times than she could count. When she hit the starter, the twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans spooled up with that unmistakable warthog growl, a sound that had made insurgents dive for cover and friendlies breathe a little easier. By the time the base lights dimmed under the first blush of dawn, Erin had taxied to the runway threshold. Her call sign cracked over the tower frequency. Sentinel Tower, Vixen 7 requesting clearance for low-level navigation training, Raven Gorge Run. A beat of silence. Then the startled voice of the air traffic controller. Vixen 7, negative. That's restricted airspace. Erin's voice was steady. Not for the next 12 minutes. The takeoff was clean. Nose up, gear in, throttles forward. She skimmed low over the tarmac, staying under radar arcs until the gorge loomed ahead, a jagged slit in the earth framed by sandstone cliffs. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, painting the rock in golden shadow. At the gorge's mouth, she dropped to 100 feet, then 60. The walls rose on either side, narrowing the sky to a strip above her canopy. The A-10's wingspan left little room for error, barely a dozen feet between her wingtips and the stone. Her hands rested light on the stick, every movement precise, almost delicate. Overcorrect, and she'd clip a wall, undercorrect, and the wind would do it for her. By the second mile, she was down to 12 feet above the floor. From the outside, that number sounded absurd, almost suicidal. But here's the truth. In combat, flying low isn't about showing off. It's about survival. The lower you fly, the harder it is for enemy radar to lock you. The ground clutter confuses targeting systems. You trade altitude for stealth. But at 12 feet, there is zero forgiveness. No altitude buffer, no time to recover from a gust, no margin for misreading the terrain. You live entirely in the next 2 seconds, and nothing else matters. The gorge twisted. Erin banked hard left. The wingtips skimming so close to the walls she could see individual layers of rock blur past. Dust kicked up by her engines swirled into the slipstream, peppering the fuselage. The altimeter flickered between 12 and 15 feet, dipping once into single digits before she eased back just enough to clear a rise in the canyon floor. The sound inside the cockpit was a mix of engine roar, wind shear, and the muted thunk-thunk-thunk of sand hitting metal. Her focus tunneled. Every muscle in her arms read the A-10's weight and momentum. She wasn't flying through Raven Gorge. She was threading it, stitch by stitch, with the needle's eye always just ahead. Halfway through, an updraft hit, shoving the warthog toward the right wall. Erin countered with a quick stick correction and a touch of rudder, letting the airflow push her sideways before riding it back into center. That's the difference between a low-level pilot and a thrill-seeker. The thrill-seeker fights the air, the pilot reads it, works with it, and makes it an ally. She knew the wind here like she knew the lines in her own palm, the places where it would betray you, and the moments when it could save you. The final turn came fast, a sharp S-curve that funneled into a narrow straightaway. She lined it up perfectly, the nose steady, the engines singing at just the right pitch. And then she was out. The canyon spilling open into flat desert, the A-10 tearing low across the sand like a shadow. Back at the base perimeter, the runway was lined with figures. SEALs, pilots, maintenance crews, even the contractors from Apex. She could see their heads turn as she approached, impossibly low, the dust trailing her like a comet's tail. At the last second, she pulled into a steep climb, rolling inverted before leveling out for the landing approach. The Warthog touched down smooth, the tires chirping against the tarmac. Engines idled. The canopy hissed open. She climbed out, unhurried, helmet tucked under one arm. The same Erin Cross they'd seen every day. Clipboard, coffee, quiet voice. Except now the desert wind whipped at her flight suit, and her eyes carried the stillness of someone who just danced with gravity and won. From where I stand, that moment wasn't just about proving she could still fly. It was about teaching the lesson no simulator, no spreadsheet, and no budget meeting could ever capture. At 12 feet, you aren't proving your skill. You're proving your judgment, the discipline to know exactly how far you can push before the margin disappears. And that's what the loudest voices in the room often forget. In combat, the margin is life. The crowd around the A-10 didn't speak at first. Even the desert wind seemed to pause, as if the canyon run had stunned nature itself. Erin stepped onto the tarmac, her boots crunching against the grit. Colonel Hartwell was the first to break the silence. "Lieutenant Cross, what in God's name—" "Captain," Erin corrected quietly, handing him a folded sheet of paper. It was her service record, the unredacted one. Hartwell scanned it, his eyes flicking from line to line. 64 combat missions, 47 close air support sorties, 1 shoot-down over Yemen during a marine extraction. Minimum altitude achieved in combat, 8 feet above ground level. The SEALs leaned in, trying to catch glimpses of the page. "That's why Raven Gorge is restricted," Erin said, her voice level. "I've flown it, in terrain like it, more times than I care to count. I've seen what it takes to survive it, and I've seen what happens to pilots who think survival is just another skill to master." She let that hang in the air. It's not about proving you can. It's about knowing when you shouldn't. Victor Kane from Apex Defense shifted uncomfortably, his polished confidence faltering. "We didn't have those details on record," he admitted. "You didn't ask," Erin replied simply. By that afternoon, a formal announcement came from Hartwell in the main briefing room. Erin stood at the back as he addressed the entire operations staff, SEAL teams, and visiting committee. Effective immediately, Captain Erin Cross will oversee all high-risk flight training operations at Sentinel. Her recommendations on airspace restrictions are final. No appeals. No outside contractor overrides. He glanced at Kane, who avoided eye contact. We don't gamble with lives here. We train to win and to come home. In the weeks that followed, the red line over Raven Gorge stayed right where Erin had drawn it. But under her supervision, a new program emerged: precision, low-level flight training. Not a daredevil's playground, but a discipline, part art, part survival science. And that's where Sergeant Blake Moreno reappeared. The same man who had laughed loudest during the review meeting now stood at attention in Erin's office doorway. "Ma'am, I'd like to apply for the low-level course." Erin studied him. "Why?" "Because I didn't respect what I didn't understand," he admitted. "I want to learn. For real this time." She nodded. "Then you start tomorrow. And understand this: you're going to learn when to pull back just as much as you'll learn how to push forward." Training under Erin was nothing like the SEALs expected. There were no dramatic canyon dives on day one. The first week was all math and maps. Altitude to clearance ratios, wind shear patterns, terrain shadow mapping. Moreno grumbled at first, but over time, his notes grew dense with calculations and diagrams. On the third week, Erin finally put him in a simulator for a mock run through a virtual Raven Gorge. He crashed on the second turn. She reset the sim. Again. By the 10th run, he made it halfway. By the 20th, he finished, but just barely, with multiple warning alarms blaring. "That's why we train," she told him. "So when you face the real thing, you don't have to guess." From my perspective, Moreno's change was the clearest proof of Erin's impact. The same pilot who once saw restrictions as fear now carried a small notebook everywhere, jotting wind readings and terrain notes like they were gospel. He began telling younger recruits the same thing Erin had told him. The gorge doesn't care about your skill, only your discipline. 3 months later, Erin stood on the flight line, watching a formation of A-10s return from a controlled low-level exercise. Among them was Moreno, his run flawless, his exit steady and deliberate. He could fly the gorge at 30 feet now, safely. But more importantly, he knew when not to. That was her real legacy. Not the canyon run that silenced a base, not the service record that made Pentagon contractors eat their words, but the absence of memorial plaques for pilots who didn't come home. Because in the end, Erin Cross wasn't training people to be fearless. She was training them to be impossible to kill. The kind of pilots who could do what seemed unthinkable, but who also knew when to walk away from the edge. And that in combat is the only reason you ever get to come home at all. When you strip away the military setting, the roar of jet engines, and the dust of Raven Gorge, Erin Cross's story is really about something universal: knowing the difference between courage and recklessness. In modern America, that lesson matters more than we think. We live in a culture that celebrates going big in business, sports, even daily life. Take the leap, push the limit, break the rules. But here's the truth: not every risk is worth taking. And the people who survive the longest aren't the ones who flirt with disaster for applause. They're the ones who know exactly when to stop, recalculate, and try again later. Erin's discipline came from the harshest classroom possible: combat. But the same principle applies to everyday choices. Maybe for you, it's knowing when to walk away from a bad deal, or when to slow down in traffic instead of winning a merge, or when to tell someone you care about that they're heading into something dangerous. It's the wisdom to think 2 steps ahead, even if no one notices, especially if no one notices. And here's another truth her story shows us: quiet competence often gets overlooked. In our workplaces, families, even communities, we sometimes dismiss the people who don't make the most noise. But as we saw with Erin, those are often the very people holding everything together when it counts. Now, I'd like to hear from you. How do you see this lesson fitting into your own life? Have you ever been in a situation where walking away was the bravest thing you could do? Or maybe you've known someone like Erin, underestimated until the moment their skills saved the day? Share your stories in the comments. I read as many as I can, and they add so much to the conversation. If you've been with us through this whole journey, thank you. Stories like this are why we do what we do here. If it spoke to you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Because somewhere out there, another quiet Erin Cross is carrying the weight for the rest of us, and when their moment comes, I want you to be here to witness it.